One July morning in Normandy, the finest rifleman on the field discovered that being the best no longer mattered for anything. He had 3 years of war behind him, and one of the finest rifles made resting in his hands, and none of it spared him. What beat him did not come from a bolder man or a calmer aim. It came from a red brick factory, 3,000 miles away, and from a quiet-spoken, half-deaf immigrant who loved ice skating and machine tools, who never saw a combat field and never earned a dollar from the weapon that armed the largest army on earth. This is the story of how an unremarkable farm boy, with an 8th grade education, was made the master of a seasoned marksman, of the toolmaker who gave his life to that miracle, and was paid nothing for it, and of the moment German soldiers picked one of these rifles off a dead American, turned it over in their hands, and understood that they had been outbuilt long before they were ever outfought. It began in the dense hedgerow country a few miles inland from the invasion beaches. A German rifleman crouched in a wall of earth and thorn, his rifle resting in a notch he had cut into the growth, his breathing slow and even. He was not a frightened boy. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a trained marksman who had survived the worst fighting the war had yet produced, and in his hands rested the Karabiner 98K, the bolt-action Mauser that German soldiers had carried in one form or another since before he was born. It was finely made, accurate to distances most men could not even see, and deeply reliable in patient hands like his. Down the sunken lane an American patrol began to move toward his position, and the German did what he had been trained to do across half a continent of war. He picked his man, exhaled, and fired. Then his hand went to the bolt, the motion worn smooth by 1,000 repetitions. Lift, pull, push, lock. He fired again, and in the half-second, his hand left the trigger to work. That bolt, the Americans answered him. What came back down the lane was not the ordered crack of trained riflemen taking turns. It was a rolling, continuous, overlapping wall of fire that never stopped to breathe, shot after shot after shot, faster than any man could work a bolt. Somewhere in the storm of it there was a thin metallic ping he did not yet understand. And then more fire, always more. He pressed his face into the cool dirt and felt something colder settle into him. He was the better shot. He knew he was the better shot, and it did not matter in the slightest, because for every single round he could send down that lane, the unremarkable Americans in front of him could send 8. The answer to that marksman had been machined years before he ever reached the hedgerow, in an arsenal on a hill above the Connecticut River in Springfield, Massachusetts. It had been designed not by a general or a war hero, but by a reserved mechanic who would never earn a cent from it. His rifle was already rolling off the assembly lines by the millions, pressed into the hands of farm kids from Iowa, and office men from Brooklyn and mechanics from Georgia, men who had never hunted, never soldiered, never fired a weapon before the recruiting office. And it turned each of those unremarkable men into something the German veteran, with all his skill and all his experience, could not match. The Germans believed the war would be won by the better soldier. The Americans were about to prove it would be won by the stronger factory. To understand why one rifle mattered so much, you have to understand what every other army in the world was carrying and why they thought it was enough. In 1939, in 1941, even in 1944, the standard infantry rifle of nearly every major power was a bolt-action weapon, whose core design had not meaningfully changed since the First World War. The German Karabiner 98K, the British Lee Enfield, the Soviet Mosin Nagant, the Japanese Arisaka, each was fine in its way, accurate and dependable, and each shared the same fundamental limit. After every single shot, the soldier had to take his hand off the trigger, grip the bolt, lift it, draw it back to eject the spent cartridge, push it forward to chamber a fresh one, and lock it down before he could fire again. A trained man could do it quickly. He could not do it without stopping. And in the instant he was working that bolt, his rifle was nothing more than an awkward club, and he was not shooting at the enemy at all. The world's armies accepted this limit because their experts told them it was wise to accept it. A self-loading rifle, the orthodoxy held, was a reckless idea. It would tempt soldiers to waste ammunition, spraying rounds wildly instead of making each shot count, and an army that burned through bullets that fast would empty its supply wagons and starve its own attack. The mechanisms were too complex. The critics said, too delicate, too full of springs and gas ports that would clog with mud and sand and jam at the worst possible moment. And even if such a rifle could be made to work, it could never be manufactured cheaply enough or quickly enough to arm millions of men. Better, the experts agreed, to trust the simple bolt and the well-trained marksman. The German army built its entire infantry squad around that thinking. With one crucial twist, the heart of the German squad was not the riflemen at all. It was the machine gun, the fast-firing MG-34. And later, the terrifying MG-42, and the riflemen existed largely to protect that gun, to carry its ammunition, and to feed its appetite. Take away the machine gun, and the German squad was a handful of men, working bolts one shot at a time. The man who broke that orthodoxy had no interest in military theory. John Garand was born in 1888 in Canada, Quebec, one of 12 children, and he came to America as a boy when his family crossed the border looking for work in the textile mills of New England. He left school early and went to work on the factory floor. And there he discovered the one thing he was extraordinarily good at. He understood machines. He understood how metal moved, how parts fit, how a thing could be designed not only to work, but to be made the same way 10,000 times over. He was a toolmaker by trade and a tinkerer by nature. And in 1919, he took a position at the United States Armory in Springfield, the government's own gun factory, where he would spend the rest of his working life there, year after patient year, for more than a decade and a half. He struggled with the problem the experts had given up on. He designed a rifle that used the gas from its own fired cartridge, blown off through a tiny port to push back a piston that ejected the spent round, chambered a fresh one, and cocked the weapon to fire again, all in a fraction of a second, all without the soldier ever moving his hand from the trigger. In 1936, the United States Army adopted his design as its standard infantry rifle, the United States Rifle, caliber .30, M1. It was the first self-loading rifle in history to become the general issue weapon of any major army on Earth. It fired the powerful .30-06 cartridge, the same round the old bolt-action Springfield had used. It fed from a clip of 8 rounds inserted from the top, and when the last of those 8 was fired, the empty clip ejected upward with a distinctive high metallic ping. It was tough where the critics had predicted weakness. It was reliable in mud, dust, and rain where they had predicted jams. And the real genius of it was not even in the firing mechanism. It was that Garand, the toolmaker, had designed the weapon from the beginning to be manufactured in vast quantities by unremarkable factory workers, to tolerances that American industry could actually hold. More than 4 million M1 rifles were built during the war, pouring out of Springfield Armory and the Winchester Company, more than enough to put one into the hands of every American rifleman and to keep replacing them as fast as they were lost. Germany, with all its precision and all its engineering pride, never came close to arming its infantry this way. And the gap was not an accident. It was the whole story of the war in miniature. The math of that rifle is what broke men like the marksman in the hedgerow. A skilled soldier with a bolt-action rifle, working the bolt as fast as he could while still aiming, could fire, perhaps 10 to 15, aim shots in a minute before the bolt stroke ate his time. A soldier with an M1 Garand, no more skilled and perhaps far less, could fire 40 to 50 aimed shots in that same minute, simply because the rifle reloaded itself and his hand never left the trigger. 2 to 3 times the volume of aimed fire from every single man. Now multiply that across a squad of 12, then across a platoon of 40, then across a company of nearly 200. The German squad's firepower was concentrated in one fast machine gun surrounded by single-shot riflemen. The American squad was a wall of self-loading rifles, every man a source of rapid aimed fire, with their own automatic weapons layered on top. When the two collided, the German marksman's superior accuracy vanished under a volume of fire he simply could not answer. German soldiers wrote home, told their interrogators, and recorded in their own accounts that the Americans seemed to be armed entirely with machine guns, that every man fired like a squad. that the volume of fire coming back at them was unlike anything they had faced from the British or even the Soviets. They were not facing machine guns. They were facing unremarkable men with John Garand's rifle. General George Patton, who was not a man given to sentiment about equipment, wrote in January of 1945 that in his opinion the M1 was the greatest battle implement ever devised. There is a story that grew up around that distinctive ping, the sound of the empty clip ejecting, and it is worth telling for what it reveals, even where historians still argue over how true it was. The story goes that German and Japanese soldiers discovered to listen for the ping because it told them an American had just fired his eighth and final round and stood for a moment with an empty rifle, and that in that moment they would rush him. And the story goes that the Americans discovered the counter, that a clever soldier would throw an empty clip against a rock to make the ping on purpose, baiting the enemy out of cover to be cut down by the 7 rounds still in his rifle. Whether men could truly hear that small sound over the roar of combat, whether it happened often or rarely, or mostly in the retelling, the story survived for a reason. It captured a truth the soldiers felt in their bones. The American rifle changed the very rhythm of a firefight, and the enemy spent the war reacting to it, listening for it, fearing it, and trying in vain to find its weakness. The sharpest proof of how badly the Germans wanted what the Americans had came from the German army itself. Soldiers who captured an M1 off the combat field valued it, kept it, used it, and were reluctant to give it up, exactly as they had been reluctant to surrender captured American radios and vehicles. The German military, which cataloged every piece of foreign equipment it pressed into service, gave the captured Garand its own official designation in the Wehrmacht inventory. The rifle the German experts had once dismissed as the kind of wasteful gadget a soft industrial democracy would build was now a catalog sought after prize in the army of the master race. And Germany did, eventually, understand what it had missed. German engineers built self-loading rifles of their own, the Gewehr 41 and the improved Wehr 43. And near the war's end, they fielded the Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first true assault rifle, a genuinely brilliant weapon that pointed the way to the future of infantry combat. But all of it came too late, and in numbers far too small. The Gewehr 43 reached the front only in 1943, and never in quantity. The Sturmgewehr arrived in 1944, when the war was already lost. Germany could build only a fraction of what it needed, while Allied bombs fell on its factories. Germany recognized the idea. It could not outproduce the idea. By the time German industry grasped that the future belonged to the self-loading rifle, America had already armed its entire infantry that way, and had been doing it for years. The man who made it all possible received nearly nothing. John Garand, like so many of the silent men whose work won the war, was a government employee, and the law of the time meant that the patents on his rifle belonged not to him, but to the United States. He assigned them to the government freely, and he earned no royalty on the more than 4 million rifles built to his design during the war, nor on the millions more that followed. He drew only his civil servant salary, year after year, while the weapon he had spent his life perfecting became the most important infantry rifle in the world. Late in the war, a bill was introduced in Congress to award him $100,000 in recognition of what he had given his country, a fraction of what his work was worth. It never passed. John Garand retired from Springfield Armory on an unremarkable pension, tinkered in his workshop, and died in 1974, a man whose name most of the soldiers he armed never even knew. The rifle that turned unremarkable men into a wall of fire made a fortune for no one, and a story of a man who asked for nothing. This is the thread that runs through every part of the American war, the thread the Germans never managed to cut. The world was full of better marksmen than the average American GI. The German veteran in the hedgerow was one of them, and there were hundreds of thousands like him. Men who could shoot better, who had trained longer, who knew the craft of war more deeply than the farm boy advancing up the lane toward them. America did not try to win that contest. America understood, in a way its enemies never did, until it was far too late, that it did not have to produce better marksmen. If it could simply abolish the importance of marksmanship, it used the one thing it had in greater abundance than any nation in history: its genius for mass production. To hand every unremarkable man the firepower that skill alone used to require a lifetime to earn. A factory in Massachusetts, and a quiet immigrant. Toolmaker had done what no drill sergeant could ever do. They had made the average soldier the equal, and then the master of the expert. The battle was decided, as Rommel always said it was, long before the shooting began, in the factories and on the drawing boards, by the quartermasters and the machinists, by men who would never hear a shot fired. Back in the hedgerow, the German marksman lay pressed against the earth, as the wall of American fire chewed the leaves above his head, and the patrol worked closer. He had 3 years of war behind him, and one of the finest rifles ever made in his hands, and none of it was enough, because the men coming for him did not need to be as good as he was. They only needed to be there, in numbers. Each one carrying the same 8 rounds of self-loading fire, replaced as fast as they fell by a country that could build 4 million rifles, and never feel the cost. His skill had been answered and overwhelmed, not by a better soldier, but by a better system, by an immigrant who loved machines and never made a dollar, by an arsenal on a hill above a river he would never see. That was the American way of war. It did not ask its soldiers to be the best men on the field. It only made certain that the best men on the field could not possibly shoot fast enough to win. If you found this story as compelling as we did, take a moment to like this video. It helps these forgotten stories from the Second World War reach more people. Subscribe to stay connected with the untold histories, because each one matters and each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. So leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts, and you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.